Welcome to the first episode of Circular Two Heads, where I, Gary Burnett, and Melissa Wells talk politics.
And today we're here to talk about why we need a Royal Commission into the Tasmanian Police.
We need a Royal Commission into the Tasmanian Police.
Why doesn't it seem, though, that there are any quotes from interviews that explain that decision to award a full police funeral? We can't find anything in the report that actually speaks to that decision at the top level.
But it wasn't in my terms of reference, David. That wasn't in my terms of reference.
Everyone listen to the Nurse podcast, Organised Crime, the monthly. The Rotten Core. Nick Vick tells you about the systemic issues we have here in Tasmania when it comes to abuse. Outrage over police officer linked to CSA. How did 120 men get away with this? Listen to the Garden of Eden podcast. Michael Shelton. He used to be the police minister. He was told of allegations against this guy. This happened. This is his son. And the most recent, the Tasmanian police officer stood down after being charged with accessing this. Here we are back at the beginning. The police cannot investigate the police. We need change in Tasmania. We need investigations, and we need the toxic culture to be addressed. Vote for Melissa Wells for Senate. So that's the beginning of the barriers that we see here in Tasmania. The terms of reference are always, in some way, excluding specific ecosystems.
Police should not be investigating police. And with the systemic behaviours that are happening within the Tasmanian Police here in our state, that is where the concerns stem from. This has been something that has been happening for a period of 20 plus years.
So we do have effective mechanisms of which to investigate. The problem we find are barriers are put in place. The language scope is narrow and we don't get a full picture.
Yes, the terms of reference has been a concern in situations like the Paul Reynolds and the funeral situation, the Commission of Inquiry, and you can look back over many years in our state of Tasmania and see that this has been a concern for some time.
Though we have a toxic culture here that needs to be addressed, yes. And where we look at a real-time disclosure, so a mechanism where the RTI and FOI, especially the exemptions that were given to senators and House Representatives, where we can look at things in real time, which would give instant whistleblower protections. It would be able to access the documents as they were happening. So we wouldn't have to be spending more money on royal commissions because we'd be able to access what they're doing. But currently in Tasmania, we get things 3 monthly. We don't get a daily diary. We have to wait until 3 months. And even then I'm having to write more RTIs and be on them to be posting the disclosures. So with the toxic culture, so smaller government hindered, in my opinion, the actual terms of reference to be able to investigate appropriately the Commission of Inquiry. So here's an example.
And 27 other claims were contemporary, which meant they were current. I don't know how those numbers stack up next to schools in other parts of Australia, but in a state of just 500,000 people, the number seems high. And when we look at teachers who were prosecuted, it looks as though a disproportionate number clustered around particular schools.
Inquiry hears of teacher pedophile ring. Earlier today, the Commission heard from a former teacher who claimed up to 8 Hutchins teachers were involved in pedophilia.
The Australian Royal Commission, which began around 2012 and delivered its final report a few years later, came a decade-ish before the Tasmanian-centric Commission of Inquiry into institutional child sexual abuse. This was one of the revelations to emerge from the Royal Commission in 2014.
Jeffrey Ailing, 74, started his teaching career at Hutchins School in 1962 before quitting 3 years later because of the school's failure to deal with the problem of widespread sexual abuse of students.
The Hutchins School in Hobart is private, which means parents pay fees. And it also means it was not part of the recent Tassie Commission of Inquiry's terms of reference. So it didn't feature in its final report and was not a focus in witness hearings.
So there's one example when we come to this public-private and people want the smaller government, they want to be able to it makes it harder for us to investigate criminal activity. And there's an example of why smaller government doesn't work. There's an example of the nepotism of the certain clusters that get together and make sure that their little mates do not fall within the terms of reference. Toxic culture here in Tasmania.
And real-time data in the world of technology that we live in today, there is no excuse why we can't have access to real-time data.
Yeah, real-time data for the diaries. Who are they talking to and why?
Yep.
Advisors in a LinkedIn profile so we can see how they all work together.
Mhm.
Because one of our concerns is also when things legally get a bit messy, we start to see people being moved around the office to different portfolios and a bit of a juggle, and then we're back to square one. We're back to square one. There is a toxic culture that needs to be addressed, and we do not want a smaller government because it's easier for these things to happen. So let's listen to the second part of this.
The podcast on your phone and you live outside the Apple Isle, it can't hurt to get on your Maps app, search Tasmania and scale as close to the size of your screen as possible. So north and to the west, not too far from Devonport, at the top, there is a town called Burnie. It is home to the Marist Regional College.
Former priest becomes the 6th teacher at Burnie Marist College, convicted of historic child sex offences.
This is from The Guardian in late 2018.
Father Thomas Fulcher, 84, was sentenced at the Supreme Court in Hobart on Wednesday after pleading guilty to 3 counts of indecent assault against 2 boys, which occurred at the school between 1964 and 1967. He'll be eligible for parole after 2 years. Through most of the 1960s and 70s, the school, which catered to around 150 boarding students and a similar number of day students, operated on a staff of 12 teachers. Past students, including a former Tasmanian politician, have raised concerns that a number equivalent to half the teaching staff have since been convicted of child sex offences.
There was a sports coach of note at Marist in Burnie too, Paul Goldsmith, said to be Tasmania's most prolific pedophile at the time. He was a trainee priest turned businessman and athletics coach, convicted for sexual abuse of 20 children in the 1970s and 80s. In all these cases, there is such a thing as coincidence. But wouldn't it be nice to know with certainty whether coincidences are just that?
When it comes to child abuse, there are just these boundaries that are drawn around acceptable and unacceptable discourse, and we're never allowed to talk about child abuse as a form of organised crime.
Professor Michael Salter was among the first witnesses called to the Commission of Inquiry public hearings in Tasmania in 2022, and he's a globally recognised expert on organised abuse too. He's the chair of the Grace Tame Foundation, president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and advisor to the Australian Government's E-Safety Commissioner, a University of New South Wales academic.
I testified for about 2 hours. And really, they were drilling into the nature of like small communities and how networks form. And so there was quite an explicit discussion around organised abuse. And then the Commission of Inquiry report comes out and they say, well, this is outside of our terms of service. It's actually the first thing that they do. Now, that's not the Commissioner's fault. And this is just in the nature of public inquiries, which is that the devil is always in the terms of reference.
So the devil is in the terms of reference. So here we are, we've spent all that money and they restricted it. Smaller government and these ecosystems, these private companies, which everybody wants to jump on. These libertarians love private companies, mate. Why? We can see why. Because you don't get included in the inquiries. That's why.
And it's the terms of reference again and again and again. That is where the main concern stems from. If you don't have the right mechanism in place to begin with to be able to investigate these situations, then how it's an already predetermined outcome. So since the early 2000s, we have been advocating for a Royal Commission into the Tasmanian Police. And as you can see from that previous little snippet, things like the terms of reference are hindering an outcome. And that is why we have decided to start Tasmanians Now.
We are in the process of registering Tasmanians Now as a political party to combat corruption, toxic culture, to deal with this smaller government ecosystem that needs to be challenged, to challenge independents that are just displaced liberals playing at libertarians, and that we can put a spotlight on who's who in the room and who's who in the zoo. So you can head over to our web pages. So this is gaddy.online, as well as Melissa Wells.
So I'm Melissa Wells, your Senate candidate for 2025, is looking for change. So if you would like to become a Tasmanians Now member, please head on over to one of our websites or hit us up with an email and watch this space, because episode 2 of the podcast, Circular Two Heads, will be out soon.